Hi, my name's Emma Long and I am an illustrator. I had the pleasure of illustrating Ben Tyler and Diane Lucas's wonderful story, Walking in Gagudju Country, exploring the monsoon forest. I'm really excited to be here to share a little bit about process and create a little monsoon character with you on this episode of Draw This. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the country in which I live and work. At the moment, I'm on amazing, beautiful Yuin country on the southeast coast of Australia. It's very, very different to my home in Darwin, Garramilla, Larrakia country, but there's always something gorgeous to see and learn. I've been really homesick. Even though there's such a beautiful place, I've been really homesick for Darwin. And on one of my first little walks around my new neighbourhood, I came across a really familiar character. And that's who we're going to look at today. All throughout our book, Walking in Gagudju Country, this little character, Jiggity, turns up, saying something, trying to tell us something, having a little chat. And we see a little jiggity throughout the book. And then when we get towards the end here, we get a bit more of a detailed look at jiggity. So let's have a little look together. Let's start by having a look at some of the things we're going to use today. I've got a little sheet, A5 sheet of watercolour paper. I've got my paint, so we're just going to use a couple of different colours, a kind of darkish bluish Payne's grey colour and a lunar black. But you know, if you've just got blue and black, we can make that work. You want to make sure that your paper is fairly thick. Don't worry if you haven't got watercolour, but a thicker cartridge. We're going to use some felt tip pens, a pencil, I like to use a mechanical pencil, an eraser, and a couple of different brushes. I use the round tops, and some water. And I'm going to have a little rag next to me as well to wipe off my excess water. So let's get into it. I wanted to take you for a walk today, but it's really, really stormy down here. So we're going to have a look at this reference image to see what Jiggity looks like. We can see a few basic shapes, and we're going to break this down in our sketchbook and play with it before we actually go on our watercolour paper. We've got a little oval for the head here, and then joining up on a bit of an angle is a little upside down teardrop-ish or kind of shape. Jiggity's tail, compared to its body, is quite long. You see this bird here, his tail is quite short compared to the body, but Jiggity's tail is quite long and it fans out at the back as it bobs around and wags from side to side. So they're the things we're going to look at. Here in my sketchbook, first off, I'm just going to lay down that little oval for the head, kind of upside down-ish teardrop shape for the body. I'm going to come in, I want this little hairdo, just a tiny little hairdo there, and we're going to look at the image and just get to learn the different shapes in this bird. We can now add to those bigger shapes. And we're just playing. We're not going to worry too much about getting this perfect. This is just our playing. And even when we do start our watercolour paper, we're not going to worry too much because we're not aiming for this exactly perfect picture of Willy Wagtail. We're creating a little character. I'm thinking that we want that little fantail in our finished image. Even though we can't go for a walk today, what I did manage when I was out the other day, I saw a little Willy Wagtail. And I just sat there for a little while and had a look at the way that little bird moves around, that little tail bobbing, and just the way that it's always looking hunting around. I love that wagging tail. So we're definitely going to include that wagging tail in our final image, I think. The other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to just play with these little bits and pieces, but I want to have a little look. I can have a play with different shapes of how that bird might be. It's like in the air flying, so how its wings might be stretched out a little bit. You know, it's a pretty generic looking bird shape that I've got here on the paper, but again, it's just my sketchbook. I'm just having a little play. I do my eyes keep coming back to that little bird standing there, tail wagging, and I really do think that that's what we're gonna create, this little character sitting there today with that tail wagging. So now that I've had a play, I'm just going to get straight into it. I'm going to sketch out on my little piece of watercolour paper. Now, this Willy Wagtail, if I want its tail up, I'm thinking that the angle needs to be a bit different for the body. So all I'm going to do is just tilt that teardrop shape a little bit downward. Compared to, you know, when we did our sketch in our sketchbook, it was on its side a bit. So just tilt a little bit downward and get those legs kind of marked out a bit, tail. And you can see, just using shapes and lines to get me started. Really lightly with my pencil, so when it comes time to rub those pencil marks out, I can, or you can leave them if you like it. I'm just going to come in now like I did in my sketchbook, and I'm just going to bring some of that detail in, and I'm still looking at my image for a reference, but I'm not stressing out about whether it's perfectly like the photo. I'm just using it to add those little details so we can see that our Willy Wagtail is really going to come to life on our page. A little character. So we've got our basic character laid out now. I'm going to get my felt tips. So I've got a whole heap of felt tips, and today I've got my 0.3, which is a bit thicker, and my 0.05, and I'll just show you here. With the 0.3 you get a much thicker line, so particularly if I'm doing more cartoony stuff, I'll use a thicker line. And with the 0.05, the smaller your number gets, the smaller the tip gets. So you can see one's quite thick and one's quite thin there. I'm going to use the thin one. I always come back. My favourite is the 0.05 tip. I just really love fine work, but sometimes I'll use a 0.1 as well. Play with whatever you have at hand. This is actually a waterproof, so when you've put it on the page and it's dry, you can paint right over the top of it and it won't bleed off into your picture. Luckily, even if you don't have a waterproof marker to use today, don't stress about that, because our little jiggity is a black and white bird, we can get away with a little bit of bleed from a liner, but just be aware of that. So I'm coming in now and I'm adding, you can see I'm adding a tiny bit more detail again than with my pencil lines. I've just along the outside of my bird, I'm just adding a little bit of feathering, a little bit of texture, slight zigzag to my line there to indicate the feathers. And I'm just going to come in and lay out my eye, coming back, tiny little, sometimes I like doing tiny little details and sometimes I just don't worry about it till I get my paint. It all depends how I'm feeling at the time. And here's our finished bird, ready to go, waiting for some paint. Like I said earlier, we're going to use a kind of darkish bluish Payne's grey colour and some black today, but if you don't have a Payne's grey, like this one I'm just laying out in a little test wash here, you can just mix a tiny little bit of black with some blue and see what you come up with. And that's just because actually this Willy Wagtail isn't just black and white. We've got this whole little range of colours, and having a little wash of Payne's grey or dark blue underneath just lets us have a little bit of that colour variation come through. So you can see I've got some fairly wet paint here, and I'm using a wet on wet technique. So I've laid down some water or a wet wash of paint, and I'm dropping in some more wet paint. So it's wet into wet, and that's what we're going to do for our first layer of painting. I'm just going to put some little swatches of paint on the side here so that we can have a look at our wet on dry technique later when we come to our second layer. Now, here is our jiggity jiggity. I think I said before I'm using 2 little round brushes today. I'm going to start with some water. And what I've got to remember is that if I have any white bits, I want to leave them clear. With watercolour painting, we work light to dark. So we've got to leave our white bits nice and clear of any water and paint, and just focus on where that colour is going to be. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to start wet on wet, and instead of starting with the actual colour, I'm going to put water on the area. I'm going to start with the tail, and I'm just going to put some water, lay some water down in that beautiful fantail that I keep talking about so much. Once I'm pretty happy that I've got that laid in, I'm going to drop in some bits of that blue that I was talking about, and you can just play. And that's just going to give me a really light blue underpainting to build some of my Willy Wagtail feather textures onto. You can see I'm starting to drop a little bit of wet black paint into the wet as well. And again, look, really, I'm still learning and I'm still playing as well. And I feel pretty safe because it's my underpainting. And I know that I'm going to come back in over the top with some wet on dry techniques and fill in some more details. So again, really just playing with these wet areas. The other thing that I'm doing when I'm dropping some of this colour in is I actually want to make sure that there's some of those light bits coming through, like a little bit of sunlight shining and reflecting off those feathers. So I'm not going to smash the whole area with colour, and sometimes I'm going to put a little bit more in to have the darker bits and just see where some of those feathery things, feathery textures will be as well, and what I can create with my wet and wet. I'm pretty happy with this now, so I'm going to let it dry and come back to do some wet on dry. And you can see that I've got my white chest here, but if I really think about and look at my resource images, it's not going to be 100% white. I'm going to have a little bit of shadowing. So before I come into the body, the main black feathers again, I'm just going to add the really diluted wash. So what I've done is I've added lots and lots of water to a tiny bit of black, and I'm just using that for a bit of shadow work under the belly here. Imagining that my sun's kind of coming from that top corner, so I've got a bit of shadow right underneath. While I'm here with this really light grey, I'm going to come into my beak and just block in a tiny bit of grey on that beak. And even in my eye, I really get quite obsessed with detail. So I'm coming into my eye now. I'm going to leave a tiniest bit of white, if I can, for the little reflection in the eye. And I'll just block in a little bit of that grey. Just so that I like to, we build up layers. I'm going to do the same with the legs. Just a little bit of grey to block in that colour for the legs. And I'm not going to actually do too much more to the legs because there are some things that I like to keep fairly simple, and I think the legs are pretty cool like they are. So now's the time as well that I'm actually going to start doing a little bit of wet on dry work. The first layer that we did is completely dry now, so all the wet in wet, dropping the colour into the water layer and watching it bleed and merge everywhere. That's all dry. So I've got my wet brush and I've got my pigment, so I'm using black now, and maybe I'm mixing a little bit of the Payne's grey colour because I quite like that. It's just my personal preference. And I'm just coming in, I'm going to use my brush. I'm going to use that tip of that brush, and I'm not just going to paint willy-nilly. I actually want to get a little bit of feel of the texture of the feathers. So I'm just going to dab on the brush, on the paint onto the dry layer, and just have a look. I'm remembering that I think I've got my sun coming in from that top right corner. It's not a really strong light, but I'm going to have a lot of the darker colors to the back. That means when we're doing this, we try and keep looking at our photo or our bird or whatever we've got in front of us, and just have a look at the direction that the feathers are going in. We're not just going to go straight up and down or straight side to side. We're going to curve some of those lines and just go nice and slowly when we lay that color in. You can see now, compared to when we dropped the color in and it really spread around, that I've got that definition of those brush strokes. And like this is the swatch that we did earlier. There's no bleeding or anything. It's just a whole new kind of texture on top of that bottom layer. And you can use your brush, test using your brush in all these different ways and how your lines can curve. So we're just following the curves of the bird's feathers, and when you look at your image, you can, your reference photo or the actual bird, if you're observing it out in the wild, you'll be able to see those little glimmers of how the light reflects off and where they are. So I'm just adding the finishing details, adding a little bit more dark black paint to that eye, and just putting a little bit, another layer of grey to those legs, just to bring them out a little bit. And here is our little character. I really, really hope that you've enjoyed creating this character with me today, and it inspires you to go out there and see what other little characters you can come up with from the birds that you meet on your own walks.